September 13, 1814. The air above Baltimore Harbor hung thick with tension as British warships materialized through the morning mist like phantoms of vengeance. Major George Armistead stood atop Fort McHenry's ramparts, his weathered hands gripping the cold stone as he surveyed the approaching armada. 25 vessels, their gun ports yawning open like hungry mouths, advanced with calculated menace toward his fortress. The fate of Baltimore, perhaps the entire American Republic, now rested upon the crumbling brick walls of this star-shaped fort and the 1,000 men who defended it. The British Empire, fresh from defeating Napoleon Bonaparte, had turned its full military might toward its rebellious former colonies. Washington City lay in ruins, the president's house still smoldering from British torches lit just weeks earlier. The invaders had marched through America's capital with impunity, and now Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane commanded the most powerful naval force ever assembled in American waters. His orders were explicit: reduce Fort McHenry to rubble, capture Baltimore, and sever the United States in two. Armistead understood the mathematics of destruction facing his command. The British fleet mounted more firepower than any fortress in America could withstand. Their ships carried innovative weapons, Congreve rockets that screamed through the sky trailing fire, and massive mortar bombs weighing over 200 pounds each. These iron spheres, packed with gunpowder and fitted with timed fuses, could arc high above defensive walls and explode with devastating effect. The Major had prepared as best circumstances allowed, reinforcing weak sections of the fort's walls, positioning his limited artillery for maximum effect, and drilling his mixed force of regular army soldiers, militia, and volunteer sailors until they moved with practiced precision. Among Armistead's garrison stood men from every walk of American life. Lieutenant Colonel George MacDonald commanded regular Army troops who had survived previous engagements. Captain Joseph Nicholson led a company of volunteer artillerists from Baltimore's merchant class. Free black Americans served alongside immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and France. Judge Joseph Hopper Nicholson, who had married Armistead's sister, refused to leave despite his civilian status, determined to fight beside his brother-in-law. These men represented the Republic's founding promise, that common citizens, united by principle rather than blood or birthright, could defend their liberty against the world's greatest empire. 8 miles away, aboard the British truce vessel Minden, an anxious attorney named Francis Scott Key paced the deck in frustrated captivity. He had sailed under a flag of truce days earlier to negotiate the release of Dr. William Beans, a civilian prisoner. The British had agreed to release Beans but detained both Americans aboard ship, unwilling to let them return to Baltimore with knowledge of the impending attack. Key could see Fort McHenry in the distance, that star-shaped fortress that stood as Baltimore's only meaningful defense. He knew many of the men serving within those walls. As darkness approached on this September 13th evening, Key understood he would witness either a desperate American victory or the fort's inevitable destruction. And with it, perhaps the death of the Republic itself. The British fleet arranged itself with methodical precision as afternoon shadows lengthened across the Patapsco River. Bomb vessels, specialized ships with reinforced hulls designed to absorb the tremendous recoil of their massive mortars, anchored just beyond the range of American guns. Admiral Cochrane had positioned his ships carefully, maintaining a distance of approximately 2 miles from Fort McHenry's walls. This placement rendered American artillery largely ineffective, while allowing British mortars and rockets to rain destruction upon the fortress with relative impunity. The British commander had learned from costly urban warfare in Spain. He would reduce the American stronghold through sustained bombardment rather than risk his sailors in close-quarters combat. Major Armistead gathered his officers for final instructions as the British completed their arrangements. The fort's magazine, packed with barrels of gunpowder, represented both their greatest asset and most dangerous vulnerability. A single lucky British bomb striking the magazine would vaporize the entire fortress and everyone within it. Armistead ordered the magazine's wooden door removed and replaced with a wet sail to prevent sparks from penetrating. He stationed men with buckets ready to douse any fires immediately. Every soldier received specific instructions about where to shelter during bombardment and when to return to battle stations. The Major's steady voice and calm demeanor steadied nerves that threatened to break under the approaching storm. At approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, the British bombardment commenced with a sound unlike anything most defenders had experienced. The first mortar shell rose from HMS Terror in a high arc, its burning fuse tracing a path across the darkening sky like a malevolent star. The shell fell short, exploding in the water beyond the fort's northwestern bastion, with a concussion that sent geysers of spray 50 feet into the air. Then came another, and another, until the heavens themselves seemed to burn with ascending and descending trails of fire. The Congreve rockets followed, unstable, terrifying weapons that shrieked through the darkness, their red glare illuminating the night in hellish flashes. Inside Fort McHenry, Armistead's garrison crouched behind whatever cover the fort's design provided. The Major had forbidden his gunners from wasting ammunition by firing at targets beyond effective range, a decision that required immense discipline as British iron rained upon them. The defenders could only endure and wait, hoping their walls would withstand the onslaught, and that British commanders might eventually bring their ships within American gun range. The sound became overwhelming. The whistle of descending bombs, the explosive impacts, the crash of falling masonry, and above it all, the screams of wounded men echoing across the parade ground. Lieutenant Levi Claggett commanded the American gunners, his eyes constantly searching the darkness for targets. Occasionally, the flash of British guns or the arc of a rocket's trail would briefly illuminate an enemy vessel. Claggett would calculate range and bearing in an instant, but each time the distance proved too great. American cannons could throw their iron balls perhaps a mile and a half at extreme elevation. The British maintained a comfortable margin beyond that range. The lieutenant's frustration mounted with each passing hour, as his guns remained mostly silent, while the enemy methodically attempted to demolish everything he was sworn to protect. Historical accounts from the Maryland Historical Society document that, during this first phase of bombardment, British forces fired between 1,500 and 1,800 shells at Fort McHenry over the course of 25 hours, an average of 1 projectile per minute. Midnight approached on September 14th with no diminishment in British fury. The bombardment had continued for 5 hours without pause, transforming the world inside Fort McHenry into a nightmare realm where death descended randomly from the darkness above. 4 men lay dead in the fort's hospital, their bodies torn by shrapnel. 24 more writhed in agony from wounds ranging from minor lacerations to catastrophic injuries. Dr. William Hopkins moved among them with exhausted efficiency, performing what surgery he could by lantern light while the walls shook from nearby impacts. Major Armistead made continuous rounds of his fortress throughout the endless night, his presence among the men worth more than any speech or proclamation. He inspected damaged sections of wall, redirected firefighting efforts, and spoke calmly with soldiers whose nerves threatened to shatter. The Major knew that battles were won or lost in such moments, when exhausted, terrified men reached the limits of endurance and either found reserves of courage or collapsed into panic. His own fear he kept buried deep, presenting to his garrison only confidence and determination. When a bomb exploded 30 feet from where he stood, showering him with dirt and fragments, Armistead simply brushed off his uniform and continued his inspection as though nothing had occurred. The enormous garrison flag that Mary Pickersgill had sewn the previous year still flew above the fort despite British attempts to shoot it down. This flag measured 30 feet by 42 feet, so large that 15 stars alone measured 2 feet across. Armistead had commissioned it specifically to be visible from great distances, ensuring that both friend and enemy would know the fort remained in American hands. Throughout the bombardment, several bombs had passed within yards of the flagpole, and once a fragment of shell casing had torn through the fabric, but the banner remained aloft. Its continued presence served as a silent declaration to British commanders that their tremendous expenditure of ammunition had achieved nothing of strategic value. Aboard the Minden, Francis Scott Key watched the bombardment with mounting horror and strange fascination. Each rocket's red glare illuminated the fort in crimson snapshots, brief moments when he could confirm the flag still waved above the ramparts. Then darkness would return, absolute and terrible, until the next explosion provided another fleeting glimpse. Key understood naval bombardment in theory, but had never witnessed the reality. The concentration of violence, the apparent impossibility that anything could survive such sustained destruction. He found himself praying with an intensity he had rarely experienced, bargaining with God for the lives of friends he could see only in brief flashes of bomb light. The British strategy during these dark hours focused on methodical destruction. Admiral Cochrane's gunners aimed not at specific targets but rather saturated the fort's entire area, knowing that eventually their bombs must strike something vital, the magazine, the command center, or simply kill enough defenders that resistance would collapse. The admiral had ammunition to spare and time enough to use it. He believed that by dawn Fort McHenry would either surrender or lie in ruins, opening Baltimore to invasion and occupation. As the early morning hours of September 14th wore on, the British bombardment evolved into something more desperate and dangerous. Around 1 o'clock, Admiral Cochrane ordered several of his bomb vessels to move closer, attempting to achieve more accurate fire. This decision brought certain British ships within range of Fort McHenry's heavy guns, and Major Armistead seized the opportunity. He ordered his gunners to open fire, and the American cannons roared to life, for the first time since the bombardment began. The effect on American morale proved electric. After hours of passive endurance, the defenders could finally strike back. Lieutenant Claggett's gun crews worked with fierce efficiency, loading and firing as rapidly as the massive cannons allowed. The American 24-pound and 36-pound guns hurled iron balls toward the British vessels with gratifying accuracy. One shot struck HMS Erebus, punching through her hull and causing significant damage. Another ball passed so close to HMS Terror's powder magazine that the vessel's captain immediately ordered a hasty retreat to safer distance. Within 30 minutes, the British ships withdrew beyond American range once more, resuming their bombardment from previous positions. This brief exchange, while tactically inconclusive, demonstrated to both sides that Fort McHenry retained both the will and capability to inflict damage on its attackers. The British modified their approach after this setback. Admiral Cochrane consulted with his officers and developed a bolder plan, a coordinated naval bombardment and ground assault. British Colonel Arthur Brooke commanded approximately 4,000 troops who had landed earlier and marched toward Baltimore from the east. If these ground forces could coordinate their attack with a naval thrust directly at Fort McHenry's water batteries, they might overwhelm American defenses through simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. Cochrane ordered Captain Charles Napier to lead a squadron of lighter vessels and barges in a nighttime assault against the fort's northwestern water battery, while the bomb vessels maintained their rain of shells and rockets. Napier's force consisted of approximately 1,200 sailors and Royal Marines aboard ships' boats and shallow-draft vessels. They pushed off in darkness around 3 o'clock in the morning, rowing silently toward Fort McHenry's weakest defensive sector. The British sailors moved with practiced stealth, muffling their oars and maintaining strict silence. Napier believed they could reach the water battery before American defenders detected their approach, land troops directly beneath the fort's walls, and storm the position before adequate response could be organized. It was a bold gambit, risking significant casualties, but offering the possibility of swift victory if successful. Fort McHenry's defenders, however, had anticipated precisely such an attempt. Major Armistead had positioned several boats in the harbor equipped with warning bells and manned by alert sentries. When British vessels came within a half-mile of the fort, American lookouts spotted their dark shapes moving across the water and immediately raised the alarm. Within minutes, Armistead had shifted forces to threatened sectors and prepared his water batteries for close-range combat. The major ordered his gunners to load their cannons with grapeshot, canvas bags filled with small iron balls that transformed each cannon into a massive shotgun capable of sweeping dozens of men from a boat's deck with a single blast. The British assault force advanced into a maelstrom of American fire that shattered their nighttime approach completely. As Captain Napier's boats came within effective range, Fort McHenry's water batteries opened with devastating effect. Cannons loaded with grapeshot swept entire boats clean, killing or wounding every man aboard. Other American guns fired heated shot, cannonballs that had been placed in furnaces until they glowed red hot. These hellish projectiles could set wooden vessels ablaze upon impact, and several British boats began burning almost immediately, illuminating the harbor with orange light that made subsequent vessels perfect targets. Judge Nicholson's Baltimore Volunteer Company distinguished itself during this desperate phase of fighting. These merchants and tradesmen had trained for months, but this was their first exposure to genuine combat. They performed with remarkable steadiness, loading and firing their cannons with mechanical precision despite the chaos surrounding them. One young volunteer, barely 18 years old, continued serving his gun even after a British musket ball shattered his left arm. He used his remaining hand to help load powder charges until blood loss forced him to the rear. Such determination characterized the American defense throughout the assault. Captain Napier quickly realized his assault had failed catastrophically. The Americans were alert, well-positioned, and firing with accuracy that turned the harbor approaches into a killing ground. British boats wallowed dead in the water, their crews decimated or abandoning ship to swim for safety. Napier himself received a wound to his thigh but remained conscious and in command. He ordered the surviving boats to withdraw immediately, calling off the assault before losses became even more severe. The British sailors pulled back into the darkness, leaving behind dozens of dead and wounded floating in the harbor's bloodied waters. The nighttime assault, which British planners had hoped might turn the battle's tide, instead demonstrated Fort McHenry's continued strength and American resolve. Aboard his flagship, Admiral Cochrane received news of the failed assault with fury and frustration. He had committed substantial forces to this attack on Baltimore, expended enormous quantities of ammunition, and achieved nothing of consequence. Fort McHenry remained defiant, its walls damaged but intact, its garrison bloodied but unbroken. Moreover, British ground forces under Colonel Brooke had encountered much stronger American resistance than anticipated. Militia and regular army forces had constructed extensive earthworks east of Baltimore, and Brooke's casualties during preliminary skirmishing suggested that a direct assault on the city would prove extremely costly. The admiral faced a strategic dilemma. He could continue the bombardment indefinitely. His ships carried sufficient ammunition, but the fort showed no sign of imminent collapse. He could risk his valuable warships in a close-range duel with American guns, but the earlier exchange demonstrated such an approach might result in losing vessels without achieving the fort's surrender. Or, he could acknowledge that Fort McHenry would not fall and recommend to Colonel Brooke that ground forces withdraw without attempting to take Baltimore. None of these options appealed to Cochrane, but dawn approached rapidly, and decisions could not be postponed much longer. The pre-dawn hours of September 14th brought a subtle shift in the bombardment's intensity. British gunners, exhausted after nearly 10 hours of continuous firing, slowed their rate of fire. The constant thunder that had shaken Baltimore throughout the night diminished to intermittent crashes as bomb vessels reloaded more slowly or adjusted positions. Inside Fort McHenry, defenders used this relative lull to assess damage, tend wounded, and prepare for whatever morning might bring. Major Armistead knew the most dangerous moment still lay ahead. If British commanders committed their fleet to a final, close-range assault at dawn, his battered garrison might lack the strength to repel them. The fort's interior resembled a battlefield already, though British troops had never breached the walls. Bomb fragments littered the parade ground, creating treacherous footing in darkness. Several buildings showed significant damage, including the officers' quarters and a barracks that had suffered a direct hit, killing 2 men in their sleep. The southwest bastion had taken repeated strikes, and loose brickwork threatened to collapse entirely if bombardment resumed with previous intensity. Armistead's engineers worked frantically to shore up this weakness, piling sandbags and timbers to create temporary reinforcement before dawn fully revealed the damage to British observers. Francis Scott Key had endured the longest night of his life aboard the Minden. The attorney had no military experience, no frame of reference for understanding what he witnessed. The rocket's red glare and bombs bursting in air had continued with such regularity that he had lost count of individual explosions. Now, as darkness began yielding to the first gray light of approaching dawn, Key strained to see whether the enormous American flag still flew above Fort McHenry. In the pre-dawn gloom, he could distinguish the fort's outline but not yet determine if the flag remained, or if British fire had finally brought it down. These minutes of uncertainty stretched like hours as light slowly increased. Admiral Cochrane made his decision as dawn approached. He would order one final intensive bombardment as daylight broke, expending his remaining ammunition in a concentrated effort to force American surrender. If this ultimate attempt failed, if by mid-morning Fort McHenry still held, he would signal Colonel Brooke to withdraw his ground forces and the entire British expedition would abandon the Baltimore operation. Cochrane composed his orders carefully, knowing that this decision would face scrutiny in London. The British Empire had suffered few setbacks in this war, and Cochrane understood that Baltimore's successful defense might encourage American resistance elsewhere. The British gunners prepared for this final bombardment with grim determination. They had fired nearly all night with minimal effect, and professional pride demanded they make this last effort count. Bomb vessels moved slightly closer once more, accepting increased risk from American guns in exchange for improved accuracy. Rocket ships positioned themselves for maximum effect. As the first rays of sun touched the eastern horizon, British guns roared back to life with renewed fury. The bombardment's intensity briefly surpassed even the previous night's peak as every British vessel fired as rapidly as crews could manage. This was the Empire's final answer to American defiance. Overwhelming firepower intended to crush resistance through sheer destructive power. September 14, 1814. Dawn broke over Baltimore Harbor with a sight that Francis Scott Key would never forget. As gray light strengthened to reveal Fort McHenry through the morning mist and lingering smoke, Key's eyes found what he desperately sought. The enormous garrison flag still flew above the fort's ramparts, though tattered and bearing scars from the night's bombardment. The banner hung somewhat limply in the still morning air, but it remained aloft, its stars and stripes clearly visible even from Key's distant vantage point. The attorney felt something break loose inside his chest, relief and pride and patriotic feeling so intense it demanded expression beyond mere tears or prayers. Key reached into his pocket and withdrew a letter he had started days earlier. On the letter's reverse side, he began scribbling verse, trying to capture the emotional power of what he had just witnessed. The words came in a rush, tumbling over themselves in his haste to record them. "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming?" He wrote quickly, pausing occasionally to watch the fort and ensure the flag still flew, then returning to his composition with renewed intensity. Key understood he was witnessing a moment of national significance, though he could not yet imagine how thoroughly his verses would become woven into American identity. Inside Fort McHenry, Major Armistead stood on the ramparts beside the massive flagpole looking out at the British fleet. The ships were withdrawing. After 25 hours of continuous bombardment, after firing between 1,500 and 1,800 projectiles, after attempting a nighttime assault that failed catastrophically, Admiral Cochrane's forces were departing. British vessels hoisted anchor and began moving down the Patapsco River toward the Chesapeake Bay, abandoning their attack on Baltimore entirely. Armistead allowed himself a rare smile. His garrison had endured everything the British Empire could throw at them and remained unbroken. America would survive this war, and Fort McHenry's defense would stand as proof that determined citizens could defeat professional armies and the world's most powerful navy. The defenders began emerging from their positions as British ships receded into the distance. Men embraced, laughed, wept, and simply sat down where they stood, overcome by exhaustion and relief. 4 of their comrades lay dead, and 24 more bore wounds, but the fort remained in American hands. The garrison flag above them showed multiple holes from shell fragments, but Mary Pickersgill's sturdy stitching had held throughout the bombardment. Soldiers began calling out sections of the flag where damage was visible. "There's a hole through the 4th stripe. 2 stars have fragments missing. The canton's torn near the corner," cataloging the battle scars with something like affection. This narrative draws significantly from accounts preserved by the Maryland Historical Society and the National Park Service's historical documentation of the Battle of Fort McHenry, which provide detailed records of the bombardment's timeline, casualty figures, and the flag's remarkable survival. Judge Joseph Hopper Nicholson later wrote extensively about the battle, providing first-hand accounts that historians have relied upon for accurate reconstruction of events during those crucial hours. Lieutenant Colonel George MacDonald ordered the fort's garrison to formation on the parade ground. Despite their exhaustion, the soldiers and sailors assembled with remarkable discipline. Major Armistead walked among them, pausing to speak with individuals, shake hands, offer words of appreciation. These men, regular Army troops, militia volunteers, free Black Americans, immigrant citizens, had proven something fundamental about the American Republic. They had demonstrated that citizens motivated by belief in their nation's principles could stand against professional soldiers of a great empire and prevail. Francis Scott Key completed his poem aboard the Minden as the British fleet sailed away from Baltimore. The verses had poured from him in a creative flood unlike anything he had experienced before. He was primarily a lawyer, not a poet, yet these words came with a power and rhythm that surprised him. He had composed 4 complete stanzas, each ending with a question about whether the flag still waved, each answering with variations on freedom's endurance. Key read through what he had written, making small corrections, adjusting phrases, but the core remained exactly as it had first emerged, spontaneous, heartfelt, and undeniably powerful. The British released Key and Dr. Beans later that morning, allowing them to return to Baltimore aboard a small boat. Key worked on his verses throughout the journey, refining word choices and ensuring the meter would fit a popular British drinking song called To Anacreon in Heaven. This melody was well known to Americans, making it an ideal vehicle for Key's patriotic words. As Baltimore came into view, Key could see crowds gathered at the harbor, citizens celebrating their city's successful defense. Church bells rang throughout the city, and impromptu gatherings of people were singing and cheering in the streets. Baltimore had faced the British Empire's wrath and survived intact. Upon reaching Baltimore, Key immediately went to the Indian Queen Hotel, where he showed his verses to his brother-in-law, Judge Joseph Hopper Nicholson, who had fought at Fort McHenry and survived the bombardment. Nicholson read the poem with growing excitement, recognizing immediately its potential significance. The judge suggested the title, Defense of Fort McHenry, and took the verses to a local printer. By September 17th, just 3 days after the battle, printed broadsides of Key's poem were circulating throughout Baltimore under the title, The Star-Spangled Banner. Citizens began singing the words to the familiar Anacreon tune almost immediately. The poem's popularity spread with remarkable speed. Newspapers throughout America reprinted Key's verses within weeks. The patriotic imagery, the rocket's red glare, bombs bursting in air, the flag still waving through perilous fight, resonated powerfully with Americans who understood how close their nation had come to serious defeat. The War of 1812 had featured numerous American setbacks: Detroit's surrender, the burning of Washington, military disasters along the Canadian border. Fort McHenry's successful defense represented a turning point, a moment when Americans could point to clear victory against British forces. Major George Armistead carefully preserved the garrison flag that had flown during the bombardment. He understood its symbolic importance and kept it as a personal memento of the battle. The flag remained in the Armistead family for decades, occasionally displayed at patriotic events. Over the years, family members would sometimes cut small pieces from the flag to give as souvenirs to distinguished visitors, a practice that modern conservators view with horror, but which was common for the period. Eventually, Armistead's descendants donated the flag to the Smithsonian Institution, where it remains today as one of America's most treasured historical artifacts. The Battle of Fort McHenry's consequences extended far beyond Baltimore's immediate defense. British forces under Admiral Cochrane and Colonel Brooke withdrew completely from the Chesapeake Bay region following their failure to take the city. This withdrawal eliminated British pressure on the mid-Atlantic states and allowed American military resources to concentrate elsewhere. The successful defense demonstrated to British policymakers in London that conquering America would require far greater commitment of forces and resources than they were willing to expend. Napoleon's defeat had freed British troops for American deployment, but those same forces were needed in Europe to maintain post-war order. Britain's appetite for continuing an expensive American war was diminishing rapidly. Peace negotiations between American and British diplomats in Ghent, Belgium, received news of Fort McHenry's defense and Baltimore's survival in late October 1814. The battle influenced diplomatic discussions significantly. British negotiators had entered talks expecting to dictate harsh terms from a position of overwhelming military strength. Baltimore's successful resistance, combined with other recent American victories on Lake Champlain, convinced British diplomats that the war had reached stalemate. Neither side could achieve decisive victory without massive additional investment. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24, 1814, essentially restored pre-war boundaries and conditions without addressing any of the maritime issues that had originally caused the conflict. Francis Scott Key's poem continued gaining popularity throughout the remainder of the war and into the decades that followed. The verses captured something essential about American identity: the image of an embattled people standing firm against powerful enemies, the question of whether freedom could survive through darkness and trial, the triumphant dawn revealing liberty's endurance. Various patriotic organizations adopted the song, and military bands played it at official functions. However, the Star-Spangled Banner did not become America's official national anthem immediately. That designation would not come until March 3, 1931, when President Herbert Hoover signed congressional legislation making Key's poem the official anthem. Major George Armistead continued his military career after the war, though his health had been damaged by the stress and exposure during Fort McHenry's bombardment. He remained commander of the fort until his death in 1818 at age 48. Armistead's leadership during those crucial 25 hours in September 1814 earned him lasting recognition. The United States Army named Fort George G. Meade in Maryland partially in his honor, and numerous schools, streets, and public buildings throughout the Baltimore region bear his name. His courage under fire and his careful preparation before the battle exemplified professional military leadership at its finest. The garrison flag that flew over Fort McHenry during the bombardment underwent extensive conservation work when the Smithsonian Institution recognized its deteriorating condition in the late 20th century. Conservators spent years carefully stabilizing the fabric, which had suffered from age, previous well-intentioned but damaging repairs, and the practice of cutting souvenir pieces. The flag now rests at a controlled angle in a specially designed climate-controlled chamber at the National Museum of American History in Washington, visible to visitors but protected from light and environmental factors that might cause further deterioration. It remains the museum's most visited artifact. Fort McHenry itself became a national monument and historic shrine in 1925, recognizing its significance in American history. The National Park Service maintains the site, preserving the star-shaped fortress largely as it appeared during the War of 1812. Visitors can walk the same ramparts where Major Armistead stood during the bombardment, see reconstructed period buildings, and learn about the battle's details through interpretive programs. Each year on September 14th, the anniversary of the battle, special ceremonies commemorate the defense and the anthem it inspired. The fort remains an active military installation for ceremonial purposes while serving primarily as a powerful reminder of a moment when American resolve faced its greatest test and did not break. The broader legacy of Fort McHenry's defense lies in what it represented about the American experiment in self-governance. A diverse garrison of citizens, professional soldiers and militia volunteers, native-born and immigrants, free men of all races, had stood together against the world's preeminent military power and prevailed through courage, preparation, and commitment to principles larger than themselves. This image of ordinary citizens rising to extraordinary circumstances became central to American national mythology. The Star-Spangled Banner's enduring power derives from this fundamental story: that a republic of free people, properly motivated and led, can defend itself against any threat, and that the flag representing their shared values will still wave when dawn breaks after the longest, most perilous night.